10 years ago, an entire class of students vanished without a trace, leaving their families in endless grief. The case was closed until one mother spotted a chilling detail in an old photo. "Mum, help me," Emily jolted awake, her heart hammering against her ribs. She gasped for breath, her fingers clutching at the sheets, damp with sweat. The voice was still ringing in her ears, small and desperate. The room was cloaked in darkness, save for the faint glow of the street lamp filtering through the curtains. For a moment, she could almost believe Lisa was there, just beyond reach, calling for her. Then, reality settled like a heavy weight on her chest. It had been 10 years. 10 long, agonizing years since her daughter had disappeared. Emily reached for the framed photograph on her nightstand, her fingers brushing over Lisa's bright, laughing face. 10 years. Yet Lisa had remained forever 11 years old in this picture, her auburn curls tumbling over her shoulders, her dimples showing as she grinned at the camera. Time had not touched her here, but it had carved deep lines into Emily's own reflection in the mirror. Beside her, Matthew stirred. He turned toward her, his voice groggy. "Another dream?" She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. He sighed, rubbing his eyes before sitting up. "Come here." His arms wrapped around her, firm and steady, grounding her. Emily leaned into his warmth, but it did little to chase away the cold knot of grief lodged deep in her chest. "I heard her," Emily whispered. "I heard her voice, Matthew." His silence stretched between them, heavy and familiar. He had heard this before, so many times before. "Emily," his voice was gentle, patient, but tinged with the exhaustion of a man who had spent years clinging to hope with bare, bloodied hands. "We've gone through everything, every leaf, every theory. The police." "They don't know," Emily cut in, her voice trembling but firm. "They don't know what happened. They just gave up." Most of the parents had accepted the official explanation that the bus carrying their children had veered off the mountain road, plunging into the river below. The wreckage had never been found, but the authorities had deemed it impossible for anyone to survive the raging currents. An accident, a tragedy, case closed. But Emily had never believed it. Neither had Matthew. There had been no debris, no bodies, no evidence beyond the bus's last known location. How could an entire class of children vanish without a trace? Emily pulled away from Matthew's embrace, swinging her legs over the edge of the bed. "I need some air," she murmured, already reaching for her robe. "Emily, wait." But she was already moving, padding barefoot down the hallway, past the silent reminders of the life they once had. The house had grown too quiet without Lisa's laughter echoing through it. She slipped on her coat and stepped outside into the crisp autumn night. The air smelled of damp leaves and distant rain, the chill biting at her skin. Across the street, a lone porch light flickered, and for a fleeting second she imagined Lisa standing there, waiting, watching, her hands curled into fists. "I won't stop looking for you, baby. I promise." The next morning, Emily found herself driving towards Sarah's house. Sarah Carter had been one of the few who understood. She too had lost a daughter that day, Sally, Lisa's best friend. They had spent birthdays together, played in the backyard, whispered secrets beneath blanket forts. And then, in the blink of an eye, they were gone. Sarah's house was a modest one, nestled at the end of a quiet street. Emily parked in the driveway and took a deep breath before knocking. Moments later, the door creaked open. Sarah stood there, her expression softening the moment she saw Emily. She was a tall woman, her once black hair now streaked with silver, her deep brown eyes carrying the same haunted look Emily saw in her own reflection. "You didn't sleep again," Sarah observed, stepping aside to let her in. Emily let out a humorless chuckle. "I doubt I ever will." Sarah led her to the kitchen, where a kettle was already steaming on the stove. The smell of lavender tea filled the air, warm and comforting. "Bad night?" Sarah asked as she poured them each a cup. Emily hesitated, her fingers tightening around the ceramic mug. "I heard her, Sarah, in my dream. Lisa. She was calling for me." Sarah exhaled, setting down her cup with a quiet clink. "Emily, I know what you're going to say." Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples. "Emily, I never stopped wishing Sally would walk through that door, but we've spent 10 years chasing ghosts. At some point we have to—" "Look at this," Emily interrupted, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a worn album Sarah had given her years ago, flipping through pages of birthday parties, school plays, and sunlit afternoons. Then she stopped at a picture she had never noticed before. Her hands trembled. It was a photo taken the morning of the trip. The children stood in front of the school bus, their faces bright with excitement. There was Lisa, her arms around Sally. Behind them, standing off to the side, Tessa Thompson. Emily's breath hitched. "Sarah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why is Tessa in this picture?" Sarah frowned, leaning closer. "What?" "The principal," Emily pointed. "She was never supposed to be on that trip. The school told us only Mr. Theo and James went with the kids." Sarah's expression darkened. "That's not possible. I would have remembered if they said she was there." Emily's pulse quickened. For the first time in years, a different kind of fear settled into Emily's bones, one that whispered of secrets long buried and answers waiting in the shadows. Emily sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The photograph lay on the passenger seat beside her, its edges curling slightly from years of being tucked away in an old album. Tessa Thompson. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. Has this detail been overlooked? Or had it been deliberately erased? She picked up the photograph again, studying every inch of it. The children's faces were alight with excitement, their backpacks slung over their small shoulders. Lisa and Sally stood near the center, arms wrapped around each other. And just behind them, Tessa stood with a hand resting on the bus door. Emily swallowed hard. This changed everything. The police station was exactly as she remembered, cold, indifferent. The walls were a dull shade of beige, the air thick with the scent of old paper and stale coffee. Emily approached the front desk, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. A young officer glanced up from his paperwork, his expression neutral. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "I need to speak with someone about the school bus accident from 10 years ago," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The officer barely reacted. He typed something into his computer before shaking his head. "That case was closed a long time ago." Emily forced a breath through her nose. "I understand that. But I found something that doesn't add up." She slid the photograph onto the counter, tapping a finger against Tessa's figure. "The principal. She wasn't supposed to be there." The officer sighed, clearly unimpressed. "Ma'am, I don't think—" "Just look at it," Emily snapped, her frustration bubbling over. "Please." The officer hesitated before picking up the photo, his gaze flickering over the image. Then, with a barely concealed shrug, he set it back down. "I'm sorry, but unless there's new evidence directly related to a crime, we can't reopen the case. The official report states that the bus went off the road, No survivors. Emily clenched her jaw, but there was never any wreckage, no bodies. The river was deep and fast-moving, the officer replied flatly. It's not unusual in cases like this. Her heart pounded. It was the same answer she had been given 10 years ago, repeated like a well-rehearsed script. So that's it? She said, her voice thick with anger. You won't even consider the possibility that something else happened. The officer's expression softened just slightly. I know this must be difficult for you, but we can't investigate based on a hunch. I'm sorry. Emily bit the inside of her cheek, forcing herself to stay calm. She grabbed the photograph and stuffed it back into her purse. Right, she muttered. Thanks for nothing. And with that, she turned and walked out. The drive home felt like a blur, her mind racing in 1,000 different directions. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe she was just desperate for answers where there were none. But deep in her gut, she knew something was off. Then, as she passed through a quiet neighborhood, she spotted a familiar house. Tessa Thompson's house. Emily's hands tightened around the steering wheel. Her pulse quickened. She should keep driving. Let it go. But instead, she pulled over. For a long moment, she just sat there, watching the house from behind the windshield. The curtains were drawn, the yard immaculately kept. It looked like the home of someone who had moved on. Emily hadn't. Before she could change her mind, she stepped out of the car, smoothed the wrinkles from her coat, and marched toward the front door. She knocked twice. No answer. She knocked again. The door creaked open. Tessa stood there, older than Emily remembered, but still poised, still in control. Her eyes flickered with recognition before her lips pressed into a tight line. Emily, she said, her tone carefully neutral. It's been a long time. Emily held up the photograph. Can I come in? Tessa hesitated just for a second, then she stepped aside. The house smelled of vanilla and old wood. The living room was tidy, decorated with soft, muted tones. A bookshelf lined one wall, the spines of neatly arranged novels facing outward. It was a home built for comfort, for forgetting. Emily didn't sit. Instead, she turned, leveling Tessa with a steady gaze. You were there, she said. That day, with the children. The school said you weren't, but this, she held up the photograph. This says otherwise. Tessa's expression barely flickered. I don't see how that matters now. A flicker of something, fear, guilt, passed over the older woman's face. I left that job after the accident, she said, her voice quiet. I couldn't bear it. Losing those children. Knowing that nothing could be done. Emily narrowed her eyes. Or was it because you knew something you shouldn't? Tessa inhaled sharply. Emily, I understand that you're still grieving, but this isn't healthy. You need to let go. Let go, Emily whispered, her voice tight. My daughter was on that bus. For the first time, Tessa looked away. I know, she murmured. And I'm sorry. Emily's stomach twisted. There was something in her voice, not just sympathy, but something else. Something like guilt. She took a step forward, her heart pounding. Tessa, she said carefully, is there something you haven't told me? Tessa's lips parted slightly as if she might say something, but then a sound came from deeper in the house. A shuffling noise. Emily's breath caught. Someone else was here. Emily stood in the dimly lit doorway of Tessa Thompson's house. She had come for answers. Instead, she found more questions. And just as Emily was about to press further, he appeared. A teenage man, tall, slender, with black skin and wary eyes. He had stepped into the hallway for only a moment. just enough time for Emily to register his presence. Then, just as quickly, Tessa had turned to him. The boy hesitated, his gaze flickering toward Emily, curious, uncertain. Then he was gone, disappearing into the shadowed interior of the house. Emily swallowed, a chill creeping along her spine. Who was he? Tessa never have kids. Tessa had always been a woman of control, yet in that fleeting exchange, Emily had seen something rare, panic. She knew in her bones that Tessa was hiding something. Emily! Tessa's voice broke through her thoughts, strained yet composed. I think it's best if you go now. There's nothing more to discuss. As Emily walked away from the house, a weight settled deep in her chest. She pulled her phone from her pocket, her fingers hesitating over the screen. She had saved the number for Detective Harris for years, even though she had stopped calling long ago. The case was closed, they had told her. There was nothing more to investigate, but now, there was something. Emily pressed the call button. 1 ring, 2. No answer. She tried again. Still nothing. A cold sense of frustration coiled in her stomach. She had spent 10 years waiting for someone to listen. Now, when she finally had a reason to reach out, there was only silence. With a tired sigh, she lowered the phone. Maybe she was reading too much into this. Maybe it was all just coincidence. Tessa's reaction, the boy, the fear flashing in her eyes. But deep down, Emily knew better. And for the first time in a long time, she had found something that felt like a clue. Matthew was waiting when she got home. He stood in the kitchen, the scent of fresh coffee lingering in the air. His gaze softened the moment he saw her. You didn't call, he said, setting his mug down. I was starting to worry. Emily exhaled, running a hand through her hair. I went to see her, Matthew. Tessa. His brows furrowed. And she's lying. Matthew sighed, rubbing his temples. Emily, no, listen to me. She stepped closer, urgency tightening her voice. There was someone there, a young man. I saw him, Matthew. He was about to speak to me, but she shut him down, sent him away like she didn't want him talking. Matthew studied her carefully. And you think he knows something? Emily nodded. I don't know who he is, but the way she reacted, she was scared. And I tried calling Detective Harris, but he didn't answer. It's like no one cares anymore. Matthew reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady. I know how much this is weighing on you, but you have to stop doing this to yourself. I can't stop, she whispered. I won't. His expression was gentle, filled with the patience of a man who had heard these words countless times before. Tomorrow is Lisa's memorial, Emily. Let's focus on that, okay? We owe her that much. Emily swallowed hard, the mention of Lisa's name settling like a stone in her chest. She nodded. Okay. But the truth was, her mind was already elsewhere, on the boy in Tessa's house, on the way her stomach twisted when their eyes met, on the feeling that she was closer than she had ever been. The next morning, Emily and Matthew stopped by the florist. The bell above the door chimed as they stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of roses and lilies, the warmth of the shop contrasting against the crisp autumn chill outside. Mrs. Robinson, the florist greeted with a kind smile. I was wondering if you'd be in today. Emily managed a small nod. Same as always. The florist nodded knowingly, already reaching for the arrangement she had prepared in advance. A soft bundle of white roses, tied neatly with a ribbon the color of a pale sunrise. As Emily reached into her bag to pay, the bell chimed again. She turned and froze. Sarah had just stepped inside. For a moment, Neither of them spoke. They had been through so much together, shared the same grief, walked through the same years of unanswered questions. Sarah was the first to break the silence. "Emily," she said gently, "how are you holding up?" Emily swallowed against the lump in her throat. "I'm managing." Sarah nodded, exchanging a quiet glance with her husband. Then, stepping forward, she placed a hand on Emily's arm. "Let's go together," she said. Emily exhaled slowly, nodding. "Okay." They drove to the memorial site, where a solemn wall stood in remembrance of the children lost in the tragic accident. For years, Emily had avoided this place, unable to face the painful finality it represented. But now, as much as they wished to deny it, the weight of reality was pressing down on them. The sky hung low with thick grey clouds, casting a somber shadow over the cemetery. A hush had settled over the rows of headstones, broken only by the distant rustling of dry leaves in the wind. Emily stood beside Sarah and Matthew, the weight of loss pressing heavy against her chest as she stared at Lisa's memorial. She knelt, brushing away the fallen leaves gathered at the base of the stone. The name, Lisa Robinson, was engraved in smooth, unyielding marble. A name without a body, a grave without remains. She placed a small bouquet of white lilies at the foot of the headstone, her hands lingering for a moment, longer than necessary. It was then that she saw him. A few rows ahead, near a section where several other children's names had been etched into stone, a young man stood alone. His shoulders were hunched, his head bowed as if the weight of something unbearable pressed him downward. His hands were clasped in front of him, trembling slightly. Emily's breath caught. It was him, the boy from Tessa's house. Her heart pounded, a strange mixture of dread and urgency tightening around her ribs. Why was he here? She barely registered Matthew calling after her as she stepped away from Lisa's grave, her feet moving on instinct. The man lifted his head just slightly, swiping at his face with the sleeve of his worn-out jacket. A sudden gust of wind carried his quiet sob into the open air. Something inside Emily twisted. She picked up her pace. The young man must have sensed her movement because he turned sharply, his eyes widening in alarm. For a fleeting moment, their gazes locked. His were dark, hollowed by something far deeper than exhaustion. There was fear there, but also something raw, something fragile. Then he bolted. "Wait!" Emily called, breaking into a run. He weaved between the tombstones, his movements quick but unsteady, as if his legs didn't quite trust themselves. Emily pushed forward, not caring about the startled gasps from the few mourners still scattered across the cemetery. "Please, I just want to talk." The young man glanced back once, then hesitated. Just enough for Emily to close the distance. She reached out, fingers catching the sleeve of his jacket. He recoiled as if burned but didn't pull away. His breathing was ragged, his chest rising and falling too fast. "Who are you?" Emily asked, voice steady but gentle. The young man's jaw clenched. His gaze darted around as though looking for an escape. Emily took a step closer. "I saw you at Tessa's house." At the mention of the name, his body stiffened. His breath hitched. For a moment, she thought he might deny it, might turn and disappear before she could stop him. But instead, his shoulders sagged, and his eyes, now shimmering with something close to defeat, met hers. "My name is Manuel," he murmured. His voice was hoarse, unused. "Manuel Whitman." Emily felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "Manuel Whitman," Emily repeated, as if saying it aloud would solidify reality. He gave a small, broken nod. "I was on that bus." Emily's breath came shallow and unsteady. She searched his face, looking for any trace of the boy she had once known. Lisa had spoken of Manuel often, her classmate, her friend. She had never imagined him like this, worn, haunted, alive. How? Her voice cracked, but she swallowed the lump in her throat. How did you survive? Manuel looked past her, beyond the cemetery, beyond the present. His hands curled into fists, his entire body vibrating with something unspoken. I ran, he said, voice barely above a whisper. Emily's throat tightened. Where did they take you? Manuel shut his eyes for a moment, as if willing himself to stay in this moment, to fight against whatever memory threatened to pull him under. The rain had started again, a soft, steady drizzle that painted the cemetery in a muted grey haze. Emily and Manuel sat on a worn wooden bench beneath an old oak tree, its branches swaying in the wind. The air smelled of damp earth and fading autumn leaves, yet Emily hardly noticed. She sat rigid, her hands clenched in her lap, waiting. Manuel stared at the ground, his shoulders hunched, his fingers absently tracing the grain of the bench. His breath was slow but unsteady, as if every inhale carried the weight of something unspeakable. Finally, he spoke. It wasn't an accident, he said, voice hoarse. Tessa. She planned everything. Tessa, she whispered, the name barely forming in her throat. Manuel nodded, his jaw tightening. She worked with them, the traffickers. She set everything up, the trip, the location, even the timing. She knew exactly what she was doing. A cold, sick feeling settled in Emily's stomach. Why? Her voice cracked. Why would she do that? Manny swallowed hard. I don't know. Manny continued, his voice barely above a whisper. When we got on that bus, we thought we were going on an adventure. We had no idea. He exhaled sharply. The driver stopped in the middle of the woods. We thought it was just a rest break. Then, suddenly, everything changed. Emily leaned in, her pulse hammering against her ribs. What happened? Theo and James, the teacher and his assistant, stepped off first. They were supposed to check the area before we got out. But as soon as they did, the bus doors slammed shut. The driver locked them outside and just left them there. We screamed for them, we banged on the windows, but the bus kept going. Emily covered her mouth, horrified. They took us straight to the border, Manuel said, his voice flat, void of emotion. By the time we realized what was happening, it was too late. A shudder ran through Emily. Emily closed her eyes, trying to steady herself. What about Lisa? She forced herself to ask. Manuel hesitated. His face tightened, as though he was trying to keep something buried deep inside. I don't know, he finally said. I was separated from the girls early on, the traffickers. They had different buyers. I only heard rumors. His voice dropped, barely audible. Not all of us made it. A tear slipped down Emily's cheek. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Then Manuel let out a bitter laugh, soft and hollow. You know the worst part? He looked up at her, his dark eyes haunted. I got away. After 3 years I escaped. I thought I could go home. But by then, there was no home left for me. Emily frowned. What do you mean? My parents, Manuel said, his voice thick with something Emily couldn't quite name. They died while I was gone, car accident. No one was left. I had no family, no place to go. I was just lost. Emily's heart ached. I wandered for months. I didn't know what to do, where to go. Then one day I saw her. He let out a breath, shaking his head. Tessa. Emily's stomach clenched. She found me, Manuel murmured. Or maybe I found her. I don't even know anymore. But when she saw me, she didn't look surprised. She just smiled. Emily's hands balled into fists. "She took me in," Manuel continued. "She gave me money, a place to stay. And in return, she made me promise never to talk about what happened. She said there was no point, that the police wouldn't believe me, that the other parents had already suffered enough." Emily felt a cold fury rise in her chest. "And you believed her?" she asked, her voice shaking. Manuel looked away. "I was a kid, Emily. A scared, broken kid with nothing left. She told me I could start over, that it was too late to fix anything." Emily exhaled sharply, pressing her fingers against her temples. "Tessa convinced you to stay silent," she muttered. "She made you think it was better this way." Manuel didn't respond. Emily stared at him, her thoughts racing. This was why no one had ever come forward. Why did the case go cold? Tessa hadn't just orchestrated the crime, she had silenced the only survivor. And she had nearly gotten away with it. Emily's breathing steadied. Not anymore. A gust of wind rustled through the cemetery, carrying the faint scent of damp earth. Somewhere behind her, footsteps pounded against the stone path. Emily turned just as Sarah and Matthew came running toward them. "Emily!" Matthew's voice was thick with worry. "Are you okay?" Sarah was close behind, her dark eyes flicking between Emily and Manuel, her brow creased in confusion. "What's going on?" Emily swallowed, her throat dry. "Sarah, this is Manuel Whitman." Sarah's gaze snapped to the young man beside Emily. She took a small, hesitant step forward. "Manuel Whitman," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Manuel kept his eyes lowered, his jaw tight. "He was on the bus," Emily said, her voice trembling. "He survived." For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind howled softly between them, a haunting echo in the silence. Then Sarah shook her head, disbelief flashing in her eyes. "That's impossible," she murmured. "They all—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Manuel exhaled shakily. "I was there," he said. "And so was Sally." Sarah's face was drained of color. "Sally?" Manuel hesitated, his hands curling into fists. His entire body seemed to shrink under the weight of what he had to say next. "She didn't make it." Sarah let out a sharp breath, as if the air had been punched from her lungs. "No," she whispered. "She died that first night," Manuel continued, his voice barely audible. They injected something into her. It was too much. She didn't wake up." A strangled sound escaped Sarah's lips. Her knees buckled, and Matthew barely caught her in time. "No," she said again, shaking her head violently, as if sheer denial could undo the truth. "No, no, no," Emily reached out, gripping Sarah's trembling hand. She knew this pain, this raw, suffocating agony. She had carried it for 10 years. "I'm so sorry," Manuel whispered, his voice thick with guilt. I tried to help her, but there was nothing I could do." Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps. Her whole body shook as she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders quaking under the force of her grief. Matthew wrapped an arm around her, his own face tight with sorrow. His gaze met Emily's over Sarah's hunched form, silent and knowing. Emily turned back to Manuel, who was staring at the ground, his hands still curled into fists. "This isn't your fault," she said softly. He let out a broken laugh. "Isn't it?" Emily shook her head. "The people who did this to you, to Sally, to all of them, they're the ones to blame, and they need to pay for what they've done." Manuel's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He looked at her then, his dark eyes filled with something raw and uncertain. "They told us no one would believe us," he admitted, "that we were better off staying silent." Emily's heart clenched. They lied. Sarah lifted her head, her eyes red-rimmed but fierce. "They took my daughter from me," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "If you can help us stop them, if you can make sure this never happens to another child, then you have to tell the truth." Manuel's hands shook. He hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "I'll tell them everything." Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. This moment, this choice, it would change everything. Matthew reached for his phone. "I'm calling the police." It didn't take long. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the growing darkness, the wail of sirens shattering the quiet. Within minutes, officers were stepping out of their vehicles, scanning the cemetery with watchful eyes. A tall, graying officer approached. His gaze flicked between Emily, Sarah, and Manuel. "Who made the call?" Matthew stepped forward. "I did." He turned to Manuel. "This is Manuel Whitman. He was one of the missing children." The officer's brows furrowed. But before he could respond, Manuel spoke. "I need to tell you what happened to us." A flicker of something passed through the officer's eyes. Disbelief, shock, and then grim understanding. He reached for his radio. "Get a unit ready. We need to take his statement now." As Manuel was led toward one of the squad cars, Emily turned to the officer. "Tessa Thompson," she said. "She's involved in this. She knew he was alive. She's been hiding the truth." The officer's expression darkened. "We'll take care of it." He stepped aside, speaking into his radio. A moment later, more officers moved with swift precision, their voices clipped, their movements urgent. Then, Emily heard it. "We have an arrest warrant for Tessa Thompson." She exhaled sharply, a wave of emotions crashing over her. Relief, rage, sorrow. Beside her, Sarah wiped at her eyes, her body still trembling. But there was something else there now, something close to resolve. The interrogation room was cold, its walls bare, its fluorescent lights humming with a quiet intensity. Tessa Thompson sat stiffly in the metal chair, her hands clasped tightly together on the table. Her once pristine composure was gone. Across from her, Detective Reynolds leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Tell us everything." For a long moment, she didn't speak. Her eyes flickered to the two officers flanking the door, then to the recorder on the table, its red light blinking steadily. She swallowed hard. Then, at last, her shoulders sagged, and the words came tumbling out. She had planned it. The school trip had been a cover, a carefully orchestrated trap. She had worked with traffickers who had promised her money, protection from debts that had spiraled out of control. It was supposed to be simple. The bus would be diverted to an isolated location. The children would be separated. The authorities would be left with nothing but unanswered questions and grieving parents. She had thought she could live with it. She had been wrong. Tessa's confession sent shockwaves through the station. Officers scrambled to cross-check her claims, and within hours, pieces of a horrifying puzzle began to fall into place. The traffickers hadn't just been local criminals. They were part of a far-reaching network, one that had operated across borders for decades. The boys had been sold overseas, forced into labor under inhumane conditions. The girls had been sent to Mexico, vanishing into the dark underworld of human trafficking. Some had survived. Manuel had not. The weight of those revelations settled heavily on Emily and Sarah as they sat in the waiting area of the station, their hands intertwined like a lifeline. They had spent 10 years drowning in uncertainty, trapped between hope and despair. And now, the truth was here, brutal and unforgiving. Their daughters had not died in an accident. They had been taken, stolen, sold. Emily stared at the tiled floor, her vision blurring. Sarah's grip on her hand tightened. "At least we know now," Sarah whispered. Emily nodded, but it didn't feel like relief. It felt like grief taking on a new shape, one just as heavy, just as cruel. She thought of Lisa, of Sally, of all the children who had disappeared that day. Some were gone forever, but maybe, just maybe, some could still be found, and that was something. Manuel sat in a separate room, staring down at the papers in front of him. The officers had explained everything, what would happen next, how the witness protection program worked, what kind of future he could expect now that he had come forward. For years, he had been running, hiding, surviving in the only way he knew how. But sitting here now, with the truth finally spoken aloud, he felt something shift inside him. For the first time since escaping, he wasn't alone. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. When he looked up, Emily stood in the doorway. "May I?" she asked. He nodded, and she stepped inside, closing the door behind her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything they had lost, everything they had endured, settled between them. Then Emily took a breath, her voice gentle but steady. "You're brave, Manuel," she said. "You did the right thing." He let out a shaky breath. "I don't feel brave." She gave a small, sad smile. "Neither do I." A pause. Then, cautiously, she reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "You have a chance now," she said softly. "To start over. To live." His throat tightened. He had spent so long thinking he didn't deserve that chance. But looking at Emily now, seeing the quiet strength in her eyes, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he did. So, for the first time in 10 years, he allowed himself to believe in something more than survival. He allowed himself to believe in a future. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the charges against Tessa Thompson. The once respected school principal sat motionless, her hands folded in her lap, her face devoid of emotion. There was no more room for denial, no more lies to hide behind. Emily and Matthew sat in the back, their fingers intertwined, their hearts pounding. They had waited 10 years for this moment to see justice served. But as the judge's voice echoed through the chamber, Emily felt no triumph, no satisfaction. Only exhaustion, only the aching weight of everything that had been lost. Tessa was convicted, yet Emily knew the fight was far from over. A week later, a detective arrived at their doorstep with news that made the ground shift beneath their feet. A list had been recovered, names of children who had been trafficked overseas. Each entry detailed where they had been sold, where they had been sent. Many of the names had fates cruelly marked beside them. Deceased, missing, unaccounted for. Lisa's name was not on that list. Emily felt her legs weaken as she clutched onto the paper. "What does this mean?" she whispered. The detective hesitated. "It means there's a possibility, Mrs. Whitman. A chance that Lisa wasn't among the children who—" He stopped himself. That she could still be out there. Matthew's arm wrapped around Emily's shoulders, steadying her. She barely heard him ask the detective what came next. She could only focus on one thing. Lisa, alive, somewhere. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, not just of hope, but of fear. If Lisa was alive, then where had she been for the past 10 years? That evening, Emily, Matthew, Sarah, and Manuel stood together at the cemetery, their eyes fixed on the row of names carved into stone. Each one belonged to a child whose life had been stolen. Each one a reminder of the injustice that had shaped their lives. Emily bent down, brushing a hand across the smooth, cold marble of Lisa's memorial. "You were never supposed to be here," she thought, her chest tightening. She set down a single white rose, her fingers trembling. Then she stood. "I used to come here to grieve," she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. "To say goodbye." Sarah wiped her eyes. "And now?" Emily took a deep breath. "Now, I come to promise." Sarah and Matthew exchanged glances, but neither spoke. Manuel stepped forward. He had been quiet since hearing the news, as if something deeper had settled inside him. Now, he cleared his throat. "There was a group of us," he said slowly, "when we were taken." Emily turned to him, her heart in her throat. Manuel swallowed. "Not all of us went to the same place. Some of the girls, they were separated early on. I didn't see them again." "Do you think Lisa?" Matthew began, his voice breaking. "I don't know," Manuel admitted. "But if she wasn't on that list, maybe she was one of them. Maybe she—" He didn't finish. He didn't have to. For the first time in 10 years, there was something beyond loss. There was a possibility. The next morning, Emily and Matthew sat in their living room, poring over every detail the detective had given them. There were names, addresses, locations to investigate. Mexico, South America, Eastern Europe, places where stolen children had been sent and lost within the system. The enormity of it was staggering. But Emily wasn't afraid. She turned to Matthew, gripping his hands tightly in hers. "We're not stopping, not until we find her." His gaze met hers, steady and unwavering. "Never." Outside, the first light of dawn crept across the sky, chasing away the darkness. Emily tilted her head back, looking toward the heavens, her heart whispering a silent vow. "I will find you, Lisa, even if I have to go to the ends of the earth." And that, my friends, brings us to the end of this incredible journey, a story of loss, resilience, and an unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. But remember, Lisa's story isn't over yet. Just like Emily and Matthew, sometimes in life, we have to keep searching, keep believing, and never give up hope. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with someone who loves deep, emotional storytelling, and of course, subscribe for more powerful stories just like this one. Your support helps keep these stories alive and brings more incredible content your way. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next story. Take care and keep believing in the power of hope.